Why is it that when women are financially successful, you get less family, but when men are financially successful, you get more family? Did you know that's true? We got study after study demonstrating this really important dynamic. I think it's actually probably the most important thing to understand about the reason why children, fertility, and family just continues to degrade. There is a bizarre thing that happens that's very distinct between men and women when it comes to how we think about money. I think it's actually a good thing. It's a normal thing. It's a natural thing. There's elements of it that have gone too far, but we need to understand the dynamic at a deep level. And there was a fascinating conversation between Danica Patrick and Orion Teraban about this. So I want to play for you guys different parts of this. This was really helpful. They get into this study and this dynamic, and we need to understand this deeply. I think this is very helpful for the way that marriages need to play out well when we are building families, but also understanding just kind of cultural wide. Why is this dynamic occurring? So check out their conversation.
What's more, when women accumulate their own money, they generally don't think, finally, I can afford to have a husband and a family.
Right.
When men get their money, most of them, not all of them, but most of them think, wow, I've made it. Now I can start thinking about like getting married and starting a family. Like men share.
Okay. Now, I was saying this very polarizing kind of how women and men react. There's different reasons for this, but it is true that, yeah, it's not normal for women to, when they become financially successful, to think, oh, I can finally take care of a man and start a family. But men do think that. Why is that? And what does that do to the dynamic of creating family? All right, let's continue.
Mm.
There's this really interesting study that just came out of Denmark. And Denmark is fascinating because it's probably the most sexually egalitarian society on the planet, like in terms of like men and women and gender dynamics. And this study was really awesome because it didn't just take a small sample, it used the entire Danish population, like 1.3 million people, for 16 years. It's one of the most well-powered studies I've ever read. Basically, what the researchers found is that for every 5% permanent increase in income that you give to a man, like a raise, he is 1% more likely to reproduce relative to that baseline.
Okay.
You give the same permanent increase, this is not even a big increase, it's 5%.
Mm.
5% permanent increase in income to a woman, she's 4% less likely to have children. When you give men money, you get babies. When you give women money, you don't get babies. And that stays constant throughout their entire lives. Giving men money is a net positive for population growth. Giving women money is a net negative for population growth.
Wow.
Okay, you can imagine how unpopular this kind of finding is, especially in an incredibly egalitarian society like Denmark. But this is what they found. And wow, that is a crazy when you chart that out. Something as small as 5%, for every 5%, you get a 1% increase for men wanting to have children. For every 5% you give women, you get a 4% decrease. That just demonstrates that there is a totally different way in which men and women see financial success. And this is not something that we were well aware of because there was a time they kind of were talking about this earlier in the podcast where men monopolized the making of money. And so this was not a dynamic that even existed in society. This is a very new, historically recent dynamic that we're like trying to work through why this is happening and how this works. There's two theories for why this is happening. And so he's going to go over the theory that was suggested by the Danish study, and then he's going to go over his theory. So really pay attention to this. I'm curious which one of these two theories you think is more likely accurate, or do you have one of your own? Let me know.
What do they have? What was the causation or the correlation or like what was the finding within the study as to why?
I didn't love the interpretation that they gave, and I'll offer another one. The interpretation is basically like the reason for this is that when you give women more money, they get like golden handcuffs. Like you get a raise as a career woman, and now they have a greater opportunity cost associated with leaving the workforce and starting a family. And it's still the women who are doing the majority of the childcare. Let me spoiler alert, that's never going to change.
Yeah.
Like babies have never heard of feminism. Like babies absolutely need their mothers far more than they need their fathers. Fathers are very, very important, but that's starting in like latency, like 6, 7 years old.
Ye
By the way, I think that's a really important line. Babies have never heard of feminism. If there was one line from this whole thing that it's so important to understand that the conversation that we have as a culture, when we pit men and women against each other, we oftentimes leave out what's best for children. And so I think that's just an important thing to recognize that it's possible that what's best for children is not what's going to create the most equality between men and women. Is that possible? If you think that's impossible, then you are captured by an ideology because, of course, it's possible. And so then you actually have to do the honest work and see, well, what if children or babies really need their mothers, especially in those early years? Well, that's going to fly in the face of the goals of feminism. And so there's going to be a real concerted effort to try to hide that idea. And so I think it's a really important thing to understand. And so, whatever the interpretation of this particular study is, it's really important that we have to deal with reality with regards to what kids actually need. All right, he's going to tease out the rest of how they interpreted the study, and then Dr. Taraban's going to give his take on this.
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
well, it is so much harder as a woman, like, if you have a baby, you're gone much longer, your hormones are all over the place, maybe you're breastfeeding after if you can or want to. Like, there's the time commitment, also a just shift in priorities. There's a lot of women that go on maternity leave that don't end up coming back.
Yeah, about 25%. I looked that up, and they don't come back immediately after maternity, and some people come back for another year or 2, and then they leave,
Yeah.
right? So,
Mhm.
generally, women are in the workforce far fewer years over the lifespan than men are,
Mhm.
which also creates a lot of downstream consequences when there's DEI and gender-based quotas early on in people's careers, right? So the interpretation that I have is a little bit different, which is that throughout human history, for better or for worse, women have basically used sexual relationships to secure resources from men. If you just give the resources to women directly, they cut out the middleman. It's, like, totally rational. They get better margins. They don't have to deal with men's bullshit. And we are inconvenient and, annoying from time to time, right? So it's like,
So are we, though.
yes, that's certainly true. But what I get at is when a man starts to make it, he thinks, "Finally, I can get married and start a family." When a woman starts to make her own money, she thinks, "I don't need a man." And that's where we are.
When a man starts to make it, he thinks, finally, I can start a family. When a woman starts to make it, she thinks, finally, I don't need a man. Okay, so I do think this is part of what's happening culturally, and I think that one of the realities is that I don't necessarily think women naturally think that. I think that part of what has happened is that feminism, I think, is best defined as the movement to cause women to become maximally independent from both men and children. And that's its basic essence. And so once you become a feminist, once you believe that it's a net good thing to be independent from men in particular, then it doesn't make a lot of sense if you can get your own resources to have to deal with a husband. And of course, if you do choose to have a husband, he's sort of on thin ice because if he becomes more problems than he's worth because you don't need him for resources, you can choose independence. Then why would you continue to deal with the frustration of having a husband in that case? Part of what you want to have, of course, in that case is a covenant that's strong enough to cause both the husband and the wife to change and to become over time the kinds of people that are loving towards each other and are serving each other and looking out for each other. But of course, if you can just leave and there's not any direct consequences to leaving in terms of your lifestyle, wow, that's going to be a very attractive option. So, how do we deal with this? How do we deal with the fact that this has happened? I think that the basic thing that I take away from their conversation is we have to become the kind of culture that once again values interdependence over independence. When you try to create an entire culture that says to women, and I think feminism really was designed to do this, that independence is the ultimate goal, then you're going to have this problem. There's no way to avoid it. And one of the things that we believe as Christians is that God actually designed us to be interdependent, not just as families, but also between families in the church. And so we want to create a culture where we value needing each other. And so if you want to get out of this trap that they're describing, part of what you have to do is create the kind of lifestyle that forces interdependence, right? One of the things I love is when a young couple gets married and has kids early and often, part of what happens is immediately they start to really need each other. He really needs her to be taking care of those babies because they're coming, they're overwhelming, and she really needs him to go out and provide a really growing income for the family. And this basic idea that having more children early causes you to naturally fall into this interdependence. Now, the problem, of course, that everyone raises is, well, what happens if the relationship fractures and now you've created a situation that really is dangerous, that you cannot thrive independently because she sacrificed, her career, and he has uh, poured himself into providing for this family and now has these children that he potentially has to provide for the rest of his life. And of course, this is, again, a good design. Like, we want to drive towards interdependence and then rely on each other. But you do have to embrace that basic design, that interdependence is good, and that we need to be pursuing a mission in life that is to raise a large, vibrant family that is on mission together and that is healthy. We want to actually go after a mission that requires a high level of interdependence. What are your thoughts? I'd love to get your take on this. I find this such a fascinating discussion. I think that we are getting down to the sort of the beginning to get down to the bottom of the fertility crisis and why it's happening and what are its root causes. And I find this study really important to understand what is going on between men and women. So let me know what your thoughts are, and we'll see you next time. Hey, it's Jeremy. When April and I started our family, we had love, but no framework. Everyone was pulling in different directions. Then we discovered God's design for the household, a multi-generational team on mission. That changed everything, our rhythms, our purpose, even how we worked and rested. That's why we wrote a free course called 5 Days to Transform Your Family into a Team. It's 5 short emails with one simple step each day to help you realign your home to God's blueprint. You can sign up for free at familyteams.com/transform.